Now, as many, probably everybody here who's watching knows, it's very well understood that an extremely efficient way to do that is to teach children phonics. And that's because English is an alphabetic language. We have a systematic mapping between letters or groups of letters and their sounds. So by teaching children that relatively constrained body of knowledge about mappings between letters and sounds, we can essentially allow them to gain access to a very large number to gain access to the pronunciations of a very large number of words through sounding out those words and through that their meaning. So just to put that really clearly, the reason phonics is so valuable is because it allows, with that knowledge, that we can teach the child quite relatively quickly. It allows children to get to the sound and through that the meaning of many printed words. And the really important thing here, and this comes to this reading by sight, is that that allows children to read by themselves. They don't need to have a teacher standing over them, telling them what the words are. They can sound out the words for themselves, so they can begin to read on their own and build that all-important experience, because it's the reading experience that leads to the child reading by sight. So we're all on the same page about that with phonics. Now we run into the problem and where sight words comes in. And of course that problem is that English is a annoyingly tricky language, and there are many words in English that are what we call irregular or exception words, in that they don't completely follow those phonics rules. And where this is particularly important in terms of children beginning reading is that many of these irregular words are actually quite high in frequency. Children are going to see them very early on as they start to read simple texts. So a few examples there. We've got was, we've got the, we've got said. So it's not the case that they're not going to see these words until they've got to a certain stage of reading expertise. They're going to come across these words very early on, and this is challenging, we know, for children learning to read in English, and they find it much more difficult than children learning to read in languages that don't have these irregularities. So here is the problem. The presence of these words gets in the way of that pathway that I just talked about. So for these words, it's going to be hard for children to get to the sound of them and through that the meaning. So that's going to limit the extent to which they can read by themselves, because every time they come across one of these words, they're going to have to go and ask someone, or they're going to have to try and sound it out and get it wrong and be confused and stop, or you know, decide it's all too hard. And so that's going to get in the way of building that experience. And if they don't build that experience through the exposure, through the reading, we're not going to have a child that's reading fluently by sight. And of course we want the explicit teaching of the phonics, but it's very well known, this is the basis of things like the self-teaching hypothesis, that the expertise comes through children reading themselves. A teacher can't possibly provide all the exposure the child needs. So this is really the essence of the argument. What I would argue is that judicious sight word teaching is really just helping to achieve exactly the same thing that phonics achieves, but for a select small number of words for which phonics will not be as helpful for the child. And in doing so, what we're doing is we're ensuring the child can get to the pronunciation of the maximum number of words that they read on their own, because then they can build up that fluency. Now, when I say judicious, what do we mean here? Well, first of all, obviously, we're only interested in the high frequency words. we're interested in those words that children are going to start to see straight away, that are going to get in the way of them being able to read on their own, using their decoding skills. And the other thing, technically you could teach any word as a sight word, but it obviously makes sense to teach those ones that the child can't get to the pronunciation of via their own decoding skills. So we're talking about those irregular words. So we're talking about the saids, the was's, the words that they're going to come across almost instantly as they start to read even the simplest texts. So this is just a quote from our recent review paper, but I think it sums up the point that I'm making quite well. And this is reporting on some work by Jonathan Solity and Janet Vursden that some of you might know about. But essentially they did a kind of a content analysis of what skills a child or knowledge a child would need to be able to read the maximum number of words in typical children's texts. And what they found is that if a child or an individual had knowledge of the 64 most common letter sound mappings, so phonics rules, and approximately 90 to 100 high frequency words, they could pronounce them, get to the pronunciation of them directly, and many of those were irregular. That allowed them to read aloud 90% of the words in text that they would typically encounter. So you see the point there, I hope, in that you're equipping the child with the ability when they're reading by themselves to get to the pronunciation of the maximum number of words as quickly as possible in their reading journey. Oops, sorry. Now, I know there are objections, so I'm going to sort of perhaps try and had some initial responses to some of those, which we can then potentially pick up in questions if there's time. So one thing that often comes up is, you know, that if you give children enough phonics knowledge, if you teach them more than one mapping for a particular letter, more than one sound mapping, and so you show them the range of possible ways that certain sounds could be spelled, that essentially you get a diminishing number of words that are truly sort of irregular. My response to that would be, well, you could potentially do that, but in many cases, what you're going to be teaching are mappings that are often quite infrequent. So they maybe only occur in quite a small number of words, and they might be words that a child probably not going to see until they're much more advanced readers. So I think we need to weigh up there the value of teaching more and more mappings versus saying, well, here's this small number of really high frequency words. How about we just focus on helping them with those words and get them reading, and, you know, not wait until they need to learn these many more mappings. So it comes back to that Solity and Vursden point. We need to think about the maximum efficiency of learning for the children. And I would argue it's not necessarily, we can't necessarily assume that it's going to be more efficient to teach more and more low frequency phonics rules than perhaps teaching a small number of sight words. The other thing that's often said is that it encourages guessing. And look, any practice can be done well or not well, and there may be examples of practice where that's the case, but I don't think there's any reason why teaching sight words needs to encourage guessing. What we're talking about here is kind of the opposite of guessing in terms of what the teacher is doing. It's very direct, explicit instruction, helping a child with those particular words. And the other thing that I'd say about that is, by doing that with a teacher or potentially at home with a parent with the right kind of instruction, you're lessening the likelihood that the child will be required to guess when they're reading on their own. Because we all know it's the very early readers who don't have solid and secure decoding skills who are the ones who are likely to guess. So it's these very early readers that we want to make sure they're in a position to not have to guess, so that when they see was, they can immediately get to the pronunciation and not relying on doing some kind of strange strategy that we don't know what they're doing. There's also the argument that it might be confusing for children, that if they've learned phonics rules and then they see these words that don't follow the rules, that they might be confused and forget. And I mean, I have written before on this, and I mean, my point would just be that the evidence, there's just no evidence that that's the case, both with children who are struggling learning to read, also typical readers. There's certainly no evidence that some sight work instruction together with phonics causes any less good learning of the phonics than without the sight words. I just don't think we have evidence that that's the case. And I think I'd also suggest, this is all about how you approach it, of course, but sometimes drawing attention to an exception can help to reinforce learning of a rule. You know, it's the exception that proves the rule, as they say. So again, we'll get to sort of methods in a moment, but if this is done in the right way, where what's being done is that the exceptionality of this word is being drawn attention to, and that's done in the context of the children's phonics knowledge, it could potentially even be quite beneficial for that learning. And finally, you know, there's of course the claim that this is an incredibly inefficient way to teach, much more inefficient than giving children phonics knowledge. And well, you know, there's two things I'd say there. The first thing is, of course, we're not talking about doing all words this way. We're talking about trying to mop up the words that are going to be tricky with a decent amount of phonics knowledge. And I think the other thing to bear in mind here is that even if it's just doing one word at a time, if that word is really frequent, you're getting quite a lot of bang for your buck by teaching a child to make sure that they can get to the pronunciation of that word. So if the word is was or said, I would argue that it's quite efficient to help a child and make sure they can pronounce that word, because they're going to see that a lot of, it's only one word, but they're going to see it an awful lot of times in their reading life. So I guess that would be sort of my attempt to head off some of the points, but of course I'm very open to discussing other objections here or other experiences perhaps that people out there have had with negative experiences with sight word instruction. But of course, the other point here is that by saying I'm arguing for teaching sight words, that says nothing about how to teach the sight words. And there are, of course, multiple different ways that you could do that. And one of the things I will now tell you about some research that my collaborator, Danielle Kohlenbrander, led, just to give you an idea of some of the different ways that you might approach sight word instruction, or that sight word instruction has been approached. And I guess one of the reasons I want to show you this is because I think it would be really great if, as a group of experts, that we moved beyond just saying to sight words to having a much more nuanced discussion about how best to teach a small number of sight words. So as an example of that, so as I said, this is some work that was led by Danielle Kohlenbrander, who quite a few of you may know. And what we really wanted to do was just say, okay, let's look out there at some of the ways that sight words are sort of taught, and let's see if we can find A, evidence for them working, and B, evidence for which one appears to work best. So we had 4 conditions. We had, and I will show you much more detail about them in a minute, but the first was sort of perhaps what you might think of as most standardly the way sight words are taught, sort of look and say. So the child's just shown the word and then they say it. Then we had a condition which was look and spell. So the child saw the word and then was required to write it down, which again is perhaps quite comparable to or somewhat comparable to children taking home lists of spelling words. And then, and this is the one that perhaps people might know less about, we had what's called a mispronunciation correction condition. There's a lot of research coming out about this at the moment, but essentially mispronunciation correction involves having the child use their decoding skills and then drawing attention to the irregularity, the bit that's difficult, and having them correct that, and that they learn the word to pronounce the word that way. And then finally, we had a control condition, a waitlist control. So they were children who didn't receive any instruction at all during the period. So these were really little children. They were in kindergarten. They were in the latter part of kindergarten. So don't quote me, but I think it was term 4. We divided them into mixed ability groups of 5, and the class teachers helped us to do that. And each group was randomly assigned a condition. So it was all completely random. And this was not a large amount of instruction. This was really just a kind of proof of concept study. So they just received 10 minutes of instruction over 3 sessions in a week period. So the children were taught 12 irregular words. So we chose words that we were pretty sure the children would be familiar with in their oral language. So they were relatively frequent words, but not so frequent that they were already likely to be familiar with the written form. So there are words like young, heart, listen. And as you'll see, the control kindergarten children couldn't read these words at all, on average. Here, this is just to give you reassurance that the groups were very well matched. So they were all around 6 years old. They knew the same number of letter sounds. They could read on average the same number of words, and their oral vocabulary was also matched nicely. So all the groups were taught the same words. We also had a picture with the words. You'll see why, because it's very difficult to do the mispronunciation correction type of instruction without some kind of semantic context. So we used that there. We controlled how much the children heard, how many times the children heard the word. So in all of the conditions, the children heard the trainer say each word 4 times. And we also, of course, controlled the exposure to the written form. So they saw the written form the same number of times. And the control children, as I said, received the same training, but after the other groups had completed. So here's exactly what happened for the look and say condition. Word is shown up. The trainer says, look at this word. This is young, young. Then the picture comes up. The trainer says, say young. And the child says young, or children, groups of 5. What is the word? Young. Very good. The word is young. So you can see a very scripted thing here to control those exposures. Look and spell starts the same. Look at this word. The word is young, young. They've got their little whiteboards. Write young on your whiteboard. Young. Show me what you wrote. Okay, great work. Rub it out. Have a look at the word. Again, write it down. Good job, everybody. Rub out the word. And then finally, this is the one that perhaps requires the most explanation. This is the mispronunciation correction condition. So we, of course, we couldn't have the children sound it out for themselves in this context because we had to control whether they were getting it right or wrong and all of those sorts of things. So we have the trainer doing that and supporting them in doing that. So the trainer says, I'm going to sound out this word for you. It is young. You sound it out with me now. So the children all say young. And then the trainer says, is young a word that you know? and hopefully the children say no. And then the trainer says, so young is not a real word, but it does sound a bit like a word that we know. And just think about it, don't tell me. Again, that's because we're controlling the conditions here. So at that point, the picture comes up. That gives them the context to help to think about what that word might be, how they might modify their pronunciation to get to maybe a real word that they know. And then the trainer says, yes, the word is actually young. Can you say it? Young. Good job. Say it again. Young. Very good. Young, young. Okay. So we really worked very hard to try and make this very well matched and systematic so that we could confirm what was going on. Here's the main thing that I wanted to show you. Here are the results. So we have the grey on the left is the control group. As you can see, could read no words. The red is the look and say. The pink is the look and spell, and the purple-ish is the pronunciation correction. And I won't bog you down too much with statistics and things, but essentially all three groups were significantly better than the children that had no training at all. But as you can see, the look and spell and the mispronunciation correction were very much better than the look and say, as many of you out there might expect. The mispronunciation correction looks to be the best of them. That actually wasn't a significant difference with the look and spell. So just in this initial study, this is obviously only just a first foray into this, we would say that both mispronunciation correction and having the child spell the word, which again makes sense when you think of it in terms of focusing them on the letters within the word and their order, seemed both to be very effective and much more effective than nothing or that look and say. Now, obviously, there are still very many questions. This is just one study, although it was quite a large number of children. So, you know, questions around how many words should be taught in a session, how that should be spaced out through the kindergarten year, for example, how much repetition is optimal to maximise learning but not sort of, you know, overload children too much. This testing was obviously done just at the end of the week where they'd received the instruction. So a lot more work to be done there to see how well the words are remembered over time. And again, whether or not there might be differences in those different methods in terms of how well they would be remembered over time. Our hypothesis would be that that mispronunciation correction might well be more likely to stick, certainly, than something like the very basic non-analytic look and say type approach. So I'll conclude there. So we'll have plenty of time for hopefully questions, but I guess what I'm hoping, or hope I have somewhat convinced you of, is that I don't think we should set phonics and sight words up against each other. I think what we should do is see how they can be used together in a judicious way to maximise children's ability to pronounce the words they read when they're reading independently in texts. And, you know, as you saw with the example of the mispronunciation correction, the sight word training can draw on the children's phonics knowledge. It doesn't have to be a separate thing. It might well be that it's using the phonics knowledge, but then taking particular words and giving children some extra instruction on those words. So rather than extra instruction on maybe some other mappings or other rules, focus the extra instruction on the words and the irregularities, the difficulties within them. Because I think if we can get to the idea that we're understanding what we're doing when we teach sight words and why we're doing it, and combining that obviously with the ongoing phonics instruction, I think that's the best way of getting children on the path to reading by sight as quickly as possible. And just as a final thing, here's a paper that Danielle led that just came out earlier this year that covers a lot of these points. And also, I didn't want to bog the presentation down with lots of references to papers and things, but in that paper is the evidence that you might be looking for about the fact that teaching sight words with phonics doesn't affect learning, all of those other sorts of things that I've touched on as we've gone through the presentation. So I will stop my screen sharing, Michael.
Yeah, you can. It's up to you, really. Yeah.
Oh, I can leave it on in case people want to go back to.
Yeah, that's fine. We've got a few questions there, and if people have other questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can before 7 o'clock. Bronwyn Jones has asked, does this mean that for a word like said, you move to teaching ASA sight word, but only after they have the phonics knowledge to decode most on their own? Example, the S and the D, which is regular.
Yeah, it's a good question, and this comes to this question about when is the right time to introduce and how much do you introduce, and also, of course, makes the point that, you know, in a sense, for children in the very initial stages of learning to read, there's kind of a lot of words that they're not going, that are essentially a little bit like irregular words because they don't know the relevant phonics rules. What I would say is that, yes, ideally you would want them to at least have, well, you wouldn't start this until children at least had letter recognition of their letters, because, you know, you certainly don't want to be teaching them to sort of try and recognize this as a picture or something like that. They're meant to be focusing on the letters, and that ideally, yes, so in something like said, that they would already know S, A, I, and D. They just wouldn't know, you know, yeah, that central bit. There will be times, I think, where, again, with these very, very high frequency words, it may be a case of needing to help the child with those words even before they've got all of the, you know, other components to decode, because, again, those words occur so frequently. So the being a very simple example, I mean, I think in those cases, you're drawing attention to the letters. You're ideally perhaps telling them how you might sound that out in a mispronunciation correction type way, and then helping them with the correct pronunciation.
Tessa DeFern asks, can you offer a suggestion for what resources teachers can draw upon to identify what sight words to teach? Would you suggest the Oxford high frequency words?
Certainly, yes. Although, as I say, I would suggest that you only focus on the irregular words, not the high frequency regular ones. Because that's going to reduce the number a bit. And again, they're the ones that are going to be most difficult. So you can get lists of high frequency irregular words, or just going with the Oxford list and then, you know, using your own decoding ability to identify which are the ones that are irregular would be a good way to go.
Tessa also asks, in your interesting intervention study, do you think that a combination of MPC and then Spell could potentially produce even better outcomes than MPS only or look and spell only?
That's a really good thought. You know, mixing up the methods, and I think it would be really great to try something like that. There is certainly research to suggest that, you know, having children spell words is certainly a good way of helping them to learn to recognize it. It's perhaps not what I've focused on here for sight words, is that sight words is mainly about having a child be able to see a word and say its pronunciation. But I think spelling's important for that that broader word recognition and building that expertise there. So it could well be that putting the two together would just help to reinforce both of those things, both the ability to get to the pronunciation, but also the sort of orthographic mapping of the word, where we know spelling is very valuable for that.
And Lynn Stone concurs on that, Anne, and says that's the technique that she uses. Lisa Dono has asked, is there a phonics instruction program that is a standout compared to others? It's a big question. Question.
It's probably not really a question for me. I guess I prefer not to, favour one over others. There are so many different ones out there. And I guess because we're focusing on the sight words here, I probably, no. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say there's one single standout. I think there are a set of basic principles that a good phonics program will follow, to do with being systematic, to do with having a sequence that, again, follows in that sort of logical way that maximises the amount that children are able to read for themselves, decode for themselves as soon as possible. But I think it's probably not my place to be recommending particular ones.
And just to add to that, Lisa, if you go on the LDA website or the 5 from 5 or AusSpelled, the primary reading pledge does list a number of programs that have quite a strong evidence base. And I think there might have been 15 or so, roughly that amount. So that's well worth a starting point to have a look at. I think Tess has asked another question. She says, I wonder if including morphological instruction as part of sight word learning could make a difference. That's
another very interesting and good point. I haven't touched at all on the morphological side of things here, and this is another area that's garnering a lot of research attention at the moment. I think as the importance of phonics and the sort of the case about that has been is now more settled, researchers and also practitioners are starting to move towards some of the other systematicities in the English orthography that we might capitalise on when we're teaching children. And certainly that's where morphology comes in, because of course we have systematic relationships between, groups of letters and essentially meaning in terms of suffixes and prefixes. I guess I think morphological instruction definitely would be valuable. I wouldn't necessarily see it as linking quite so much to the sort of the way that I've been talking about sight words here, because I guess I am still very much focusing on just a small constrained number of words, as few as possible, to help get the child on the path to reading. So I wouldn't necessarily want to look towards starting to, see much broader instruction in morphological things as being part of sight word instruction. That said, I think there's more research that needs to be done, but there's certainly a case for starting to introduce, once children are on the path to reading, introduce them, of course, to some of those morphological things as part of their broader instruction in, not necessarily in sight words, but in reading generally.
Andrea Hayward Petrucci asks, I have students that can recognise sight words in isolation, but tend to miss or switch the small sight words when reading connected text. What is the best strategy for tackling this?
That's an interesting, that is an interesting one. I've seen that as well. And I think what happens is, you do get some children that once they're in the actual process of doing the reading, they tend to fall into more of a pattern of skipping and guessing at words, whether they know them or not. So, you'll also see children who will, the word is, house, and they'll say home or something else, because they're jumping ahead, they're predicting what it might be from the context, and then not necessarily looking so closely at each word. And particularly little sort of function words that they might think are relatively uninteresting, they might just tend to skip past them or just run on. The only thing that I could suggest, I don't know of any direct sort of evidence that I could draw on about that, but I wonder if have you tried to encourage them to point to each word as they're reading the text, just to ensure that they do in fact focus on each word, and you may then find that they're a little bit more likely to stop and then realise that it in fact is a word that they know.
Jen Jacoby has just commented that she has made some irregular word lists from all the HFW lists and is happy to share. So
that's wonderful.
If anyone wants to ask Jen, I'm sure she's happy to share. Sally Howell has asked, we teach sight words using the match to sample technique. 1, match print to print. 2, select print, point to word. And 3, read word when shown the print. Any comment on effectiveness of this?
I'm actually not familiar with that method. So I can't comment specifically. I guess that's certainly potentially another interesting way. It's something a little bit between the look and say and look and spell, perhaps. So I'd have to say I think it would be a matter for research like the research I showed you to see how well that works. I mean, one of the things that we were pretty sure that we wouldn't see as good learning in that look and say condition, which of course is one of the reasons that many people have objected to sight word teaching that uses that very non-analytic, just show the card and have them say the word. That said, I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that was way quicker. It was much quicker to get through the 12 items doing it that way than, for example, certainly the spelling took, for these little kindy kids especially, really took a long time. So there are other things to be considered here in terms of trade-off, in terms of the time that it takes to, get through an individual word. And it might be that, like what you're describing, would strike quite a nice balance in some ways between some of these more effortful approaches. But that said, as you can see, it was very clear that those more effortful approaches were clearly far more effective.
Alison Clark has asked, in the look and spell condition, were children sounding out the words as they wrote, saying letter names as they wrote, or spelling silently?
I would have to double check with Danielle on this, Alison, but I'm pretty sure they were just spelling silently. So we would, again, and I think the children would have been told not to speak if they started to speak. But of course, can't know exactly what they're doing in their head, but the plan was just for them to look at the word and write down its spelling. But some children in particular, I think, found that quite hard for these little children. So again, although it clearly was quite effective, maybe a better approach for slightly more advanced readers.
Edwina Wotherspoon has asked, my kindy son was given 100 words to learn by sight, but many of them are decodable. Why are children given these lists?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think this is where it comes back to so important to be clear about what we're trying to do here. So if the idea was, let's just try to increase children's familiarity with the words they're most likely to see, that might be the approach you take. But that's not, in my view, the case for sight words. That's a bit like a sort of whole language type, let's just expose kids to lots of stuff. This is much more targeted than that. And so I would advocate not teaching the 100, you know, that magic 100 words, but instead focusing on the high frequency, irregular ones. You know, I don't think it's going to do children a huge amount of harm to be getting those words, but I also don't think it's it's not a very considered approach to what's being done.
Linda Lockett says, thank you, Anne. I wonder, with a word like young, the letter combinations OU and NG are quite advanced in the sequence of phonics instruction. I wouldn't expect children in kindergarten to recognise these letter combinations. So would they make the mispronunciation correct connection?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And of course, this was just our first foray, and we were trying to come up with words that they wouldn't be able to already read, but that weren't too hard. And I think we didn't necessarily hit the sweet spot with all of those words. And I agree with you that young is an example of one where those children may well not have had the full decoding skills. And of course, that was also one of the reasons why we had the trainer sound it out for them. So even if it was one that they hadn't learned yet, in the context of this instruction, it would be sounded out for them, and then they would be given the opportunity to try and think, you know, of words in their oral vocabulary that might sound a bit like that. And that, of course, is where the picture was valuable, because the idea was the children would hear young, go, oh, you know, maybe that could be young. And there is research that if people want to write to me, I'm happy to make it available to you, but there is recent research that suggests that simply training children, even before they see words, to sort of think of the multiple ways that you know, the alternative ways that word could be pronounced, like the alternative vowel pronunciations of words, that seems to actually help, you know, provide a benefit in reading in these sort of training studies. So just almost training that as a strategy, that when children sound out a word and it doesn't quite sound right, to have a think, particularly at the vowel, what else it could be, you know, as a strategy. So I guess the other thing about that is there's teaching those individual words, but there's also giving them that strategy that they might then apply to other words as they're reading.
Catherine Bjarnenson asks, would future research include students with SLD in the study to gauge the effectiveness of these approaches and whether any modifications are required?
Yeah, that would be really important to do as well. I mean, we certainly had a range of readers here, but we didn't have nearly enough of a sample to sort of look at those kinds of things to, you know, to try and tease apart those sorts of things. I mean, certainly my hunch would be that, as with so often the case with kids with SLDs, the same basic things that work for kids without those difficulties will work for them, but it will probably require more intensity and over a longer period of time. You know, I don't think there'd be a reason to think that something completely different would be needed for those children, but it would just be a matter of discovering just how much instruction is optimal for children at different levels.
And Liang has also asked, what would be your suggestions for teachers who teach English to young second language learners?
I'm not entirely sure whether the question's relating specifically to sight words. I guess the point being that maybe they don't have this word in their oral vocabulary, which of course would make things difficult. I mean, there are a whole range of obviously issues when it comes to children who are second language learners of English, and it depends on so many things, including, you know, how far they are in their instruction, how good they're, you know, whether they have any language or none at all. But I'd come back to the general principle that we have done lots of studies that have English as a second language learners as part of the study, and, you know, we've never found any evidence that there needs to be something completely different done for them. You know, many of them, obviously, they've got a lot of learning to do, but they learn in the same sorts of ways.
And Jane Henderson asks, Kilpatrick in his book Equipped for Reading has a range of activities to orthographically map irregular words. Do you think these strategies are effective?
So orthographic mapping is sort of reading by sight end of the reading distribution. So it's a little bit different. And this is again where it's so understandable that there's so much confusion around sight words, because they are the term is used in somewhat different ways. So what Kilpatrick is talking about here is helping children to build that, you know, really rich memory representation of the spelling of a word that leads to that automaticity. And yes, you know, some of the sorts of things he described in that book, he's researched it very thoroughly, and I would endorse it. But I guess the main point is that's a little bit different from teaching sight words in very initial reading instruction, which is just, as I say, more about getting the child to be able to pronounce for themselves, as they would if they were decoding, as many words that they see in text. And that with more and more exposure and reading experience, we're building up that orthographic mapping, and some of those strategies that Kilpatrick mentions can be used to help support that ongoing building of expertise.
Sally Howell asks, were all target words matched to pictures? She says it's hard to match sight words to pictures, for example, the.
Yeah, so for this study, yes, they all were. And as I was saying, we discussed a lot whether or not to do that. But the reason we ended up having the pictures was because of the mispronunciation correction condition, where we were wanting the children to think of the oral vocabulary item that it might be. And it's just very hard to do that without, you know, having those picture reference there. But it's certainly, Sally, you're exactly right. It draws attention to the fact that maybe another thing is maybe not all methods are most suitable for all types of irregular words. So something like it might make more sense just to go for the look and spell strategy, for example, especially if we showed that they worked reasonably equally effectively. And, you know, it's harder to see well, certainly my initial reaction would be, I'm not sure there'd be a lot of value in using mispronunciation correction for a word like the, you know. It's just like, let's just, yeah, just give it to them.
And possibly our last question, I think we'll have time for. Velma Bigelhole asks, what are the links between MPC and Old Way, New Way that is used to help older students to learn to spell correctly?
Again, I'm not familiar with that technique, so I can't directly answer that question. But please, anybody who has a question or who, or if I've not answered their question sufficiently, just drop me an email. So if you want to send me an email describing the Old Way, New Way, I can attempt to see how that relates to mispronunciation correction.
All right, well, thanks so much, Anne. I think you've done a wonderful job answering all of those questions. And thanks for a fantastic presentation about sight words. I certainly know a lot more now than I did an hour ago. Thanks to everybody.
That hasn't happened before, so. Yeah.
I wish I knew more about Zoom. I could have helped you a bit more, but I'm trying my best each week. Luckily, we had Lynn online to help out there.
Yeah,
So
thank you
thanks,
so
Lynn.
much, Lynn.
No, that was very much appreciated. But thanks to everybody for joining tonight. Next week, we've got Robin Bertram, occupational therapist, and she's got a fascinating session on how to teach handwriting really well. So we look forward to that next week. Thanks so much for everybody's time. This will go up on our YouTube channel in the coming days, as long as I can work the technology. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Anne. Thanks again. All right.